Got a circle. It says we're live.
Oh, hey, we're live.
Woo!
So I don't know how many episodes have we had now, Des? What number is this?
37.
So we've had 37 episodes, and we are almost consistently good at knowing when we are live now. So really killing it. Yeah, almost. I think that's the key word there. So I am Jess, and as usual, I'm really excited to be here because I love talking about suicide. I'm a mad queer feminist care worker. I'm the director of program development at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners. I realized in my intro I don't say that I'm a suicide attempt survivor, which is like all we talk about. So I should have said that before. My organization provides the crisis and peer support lines for the state of Colorado. I'm located in so-called Denver, which is the land stolen from Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and Sioux people. And I've spent most of my career creating pathways to intersectional justice-based support for marginalized communities. I'm really excited about things like mutual aid and abolition as ways to think about suicide prevention, and really like talking about epistemology and can't avoid saying something negative about capitalism or bringing up ethics every time we talk here. So that's what you can expect from me. I'm going to let Des and our guest introduce themselves next. Des still hasn't given her introduction.
No, every time I go to write it, I'm like, I hate talking about myself. And then I leave and go do something else. So I'm Des, Dese'Rae Stage. I run Live Through This, which is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the U.S. If you want to look at that, you can go to livethroughthis.org, all the words spelled out. I care about lots of the things Jess said too. I think a lot about, I'm an MSW student right now, and I think a lot about the ways that we're treated as people who are in the mental health system seeking services, and how I can challenge that from, within my program and maybe one day as an educator. Because I see a lot of issues there, and I don't know, I run like 43 different projects, and I don't sleep. Also, I have toddlers. That's all I got. Mike?
Fair enough. I am Mike Anestis. I no longer have toddlers, so I sleep a little better than I did for the previous decade. So that's great. I am an associate professor in the School of Public Health at Rutgers University and executive director of the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. Having just moved back to the Northeast after having an unexpected walkabout in the Deep South for 15 years. Where I've been working at the University of Southern Mississippi and other places down there. So I am returned to the North.
Returned.
Right. All right. So why don't you start us off by telling us what made you interested in suicide or suicide prevention to begin with, and sort of how your career has evolved around those topics?
Yeah, sure. So, I feel like my path into being interested in suicide research is less interesting than everyone else's. I always feel like my story is not very compelling. I guess what I'd say is I was always interested in psychology, and I wanted to help some folks. And then I went in a different direction, and I had a different career, and I didn't feel like I was doing something that was providing the value I wanted to. And so I wanted to find something where I could do some good and tackle a problem that wasn't easy. And so this is sort of where I landed. And I don't know how I got into grad school, but I somehow landed in Thomas Joiner's lab, which was a real life changer for me and gave me an opportunity to learn a lot of stuff. And so I've been doing suicide research now since 2005 when I started grad school. And then what brings us to this episode is the firearm stuff. And honestly, that came from a pretty similar stance, which is I was sitting in my office in Mississippi, and I am very much not a right-leaning guy. And I felt sort of alienated from where I was living. I love the city, but I still felt very much in the distance and frustrated with the politics of it all. And I don't like just being grumpy. And so I was like, well, what's a thing that I can do? And I was like, well, I'm a nerd in this niche area, and I don't feel like anyone's doing this thing. And so maybe I can take my nerdiness and do something of value with it. And started looking into the firearm sort of angle, and was just sort of taken aback by how much there was to do and how big a deal it was. And it was a challenge, and I thought a worthy one, where a lot of folks own firearms in Mississippi, and they aren't necessarily looking to talk about this. And so it's not easy, and I think it's necessary. And so it was a chance to try and take on, again, a challenge I thought might do some good. And it wouldn't be easy and keep me busy for a while, and then just go to run with that, I think.
All right. So, so I'm interested in hearing about like what it's like to start doing research around firearms in a place like that. As like a left-leaning person, what's that experience been like for you?
Not so. I went in expecting it to be super scary, and all my friends were like, "Are you getting death threats and stuff?" So I think it was one of those like door in the face technique things where you expect something that was going to be terrible, and then it wasn't. So then it felt kind of easy. So I'd say there wasn't a lot of support at first, not in the sense that people were trying to shut door. I mean, people hang up the phone if I called, unsolicited to like a firearm instructor to say, "Hey, can we chat like that?" That would, but then I got better at not getting hung up on. But there, people were nervous, right? So people don't, I had several times where I'd want to publish a paper and they'd say, well, we're not going to do things that are political. And I'd point out, well, this is really political. This is, data and what you are supposed to be helping with. And so you encounter obstacles, but honestly, I felt like they've gotten less so over the years. Mm-hmm. And I guess, again, I mean, if you come in thinking like, well, you're going to try and tackle a problem like a firearm issue, it's usually hopeless kind of perspective at first. So when I see any glimmer of progress, I get pretty, excited about that. So I say, it hasn't been as difficult as I thought. I feel like I've met some really interesting folks doing this. I feel like the work I do now is more valuable than the work I did before. Like maybe it has a chance to do something. So that's good. Yeah, again, it's what I like about it is it forces me not to spend a lot of time thinking about folks who already agree with me, and so I have to spend a lot of time living outside my own perspective because I'm neither the person who needs this or the person who's going to most effectively deliver the message about this, but there's a role for me to play in the margins there. And so I feel like it's made me a better thinker. It's made me, I think some people get pretty arrogant about the stuff they do. I feel like doing this keeps you pretty humble because it's really complicated. And people don't, when I give talks on this kind of thing, I often ask people like, close your eyes and think about the last time you had a discussion about firearms and you or the person you're talking to changed your opinion. And I was like, the answer is zero. Like, you're not telling me, but the answer is zero. Like, it's never freaking happened, right? And so I think I enjoyed that aspect of like, maybe you can find some progress in a place where there usually isn't a lot of it.
Yeah. So you said a couple of times that you're not talking with people who agree with you and things like that. Can you tell me, and like the audience that's watching, what your perspective is about guns and suicide then?
So my perspective on guns and suicide is pretty clear, is that firearms play an enormous role in suicide death in America. So the whole experience of suicidal thoughts or suicidal desire or anything like that, it doesn't explain much of that at all, actually. But in terms of folks dying by suicide in the US, it plays this absolutely enormous role. And so my perspective on that is that it's not the firearm that explains everything. It's not to blame for a person's agony, right? But that it quite literally weaponizes that agony in a way that's very different than anything else can, and it denies folks second chances. That's the thing I always come back to, is that so many folks, it's not that life after a suicide attempt is easy breezy and wonderful all the time immediately, right? But so many folks don't go on to attempt again, and so there is that second chance. And so few people survive their initial attempt with a firearm. They never get that, right? To me, it feels really particularly tragic and sad. And so my perspective is that there's a role for us to consider the method, the firearm, not because I'm interested in changing how people die by suicide, because I think there's a legitimate chance that there are some folks who are going to live some happy lives, but because of the particular method they had ready access to, that opportunity wasn't there. And so my perspective on firearms and suicide is that it is our most direct path to reducing the suicide rate, is to get folks to have less ready access in their worst moment. There's a clearer path. I think the data says that, even better than intuition says that. But that's a tough message to sell, because the other thing I feel strongly about firearms and suicide is that that firearm owners who value safety in a lot of ways view this very differently. They view firearms very differently. They view the relationship between firearms and suicide very differently. And so the things I'm saying that sound so clear to me, where I'm telling you guys, well, this is not even ambiguous at all, I know what it is. They see it the same way, but in the opposite way. And so it's not just that I haven't convinced them completely that I'm right, it's that they're completely convinced that I'm wrong. And so as strongly convinced as I am that this is like a central big deal, the folks who I most need to convince absolutely don't believe it at all.
And so then is your perspective that like means restriction is the like the route that we want to go with firearm owners related to suicide?
So
or are there other options there?
So I think that that's one thing. It's not mutually exclusive, right? So a lot of folks, they'll be like, well, why are you talking about firearm? You should talk about the other things. And my point would be like, well, why do you talk about drunk driving? Shouldn't you talk about seatbelts? And they're like, well, I can do both. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You can do both, right? So I don't think that it's one thing someone should do. I think it's one important component of things that I talk about all the time because I think people aren't talking about enough. And so I figure there's all sorts of folks talking about all sorts of other things. They don't need me to do that for them. I talk about this all the time, not because I think it's the thing at all, but I think it's a really important thing that we are just not using enough. But I think that what I mean by means safety, and I will say, I think there are sometimes when people make linguistic distinctions that don't matter too much. This one I actually think does matter. When you say means restriction, it puts off firearm owners. It closes them off in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that to be like critical, just as an awareness thing. Means safety is the term folks will use, and that can mean a lot of things. It can mean legislation, and we're going to talk about ERPOs today and the pros and cons of that. But most of my time is spent talking about safe storage, like the reality, the same way I talk with parallels of teaching, safe sex to adolescents, right? People get all antsy, like, well, the firearms exist. So you could say, well, we should just get rid of them or legislate them away, but they're going to exist. And so you should probably teach them how to be safe. They say, well, yes, if teens weren't having sex, there'd be a lot less teenage pregnancy, right? But they're not going to stop doing that. And so it probably makes a lot of sense to teach people some tools to live safely and understand what they're doing and live a happy life, right? I take that perspective on it, that what means safety is trying to get the message across that there is some danger, some risk here, and I don't have to change who you are or devalue your sort of system of beliefs. I can just connect with the idea that you value safety, and the way you're thinking about this isn't adding up to what's actually happening.
Yeah, I think that's really useful to talk about the linguistics there. I think part of the reason, as a person with lived experience who has been sort of subjected to a lot of forced means restriction, and that's why I call it means restriction, because I think that's how it's been implemented for me. Not because I think that's how we should do it, right? So those are two different things, right? It's like means restriction has this coercive quality to it, I think, and means safety doesn't have to.
Yeah, and I think, Jess, that's a really important point, like for sure. And that's why I spend so much of my time talking about upstream, right? And so I think there's a lot of conversations about how this works in a moment of acute crisis. But if that's where we're living, if that's the space we're in when you're talking about firearms, we're not for a huge, like there's plenty of reasons we can talk about why that's not where we'll have our most success. This needs to be about cultural. This is more about changing the idea of don't get in the car and drive drunk in the first place. Not what can I do to keep safe once you're already, like having that moment that don't buy a fire extinguisher when your house is on fire kind of thing. So means safety, I move further upstream so that you're having a conversation and people can find their own way to doing what maps into their value system and go, when we do means counseling, we don't say do this exact thing with your firearms. We say, well, tell me about your values and your firearm and what it means to you and your family, your situation. Here are all these options. Where on this spectrum do you feel comfortable going? We don't criticize where they're going. We don't prescribe a specific thing, but they're also not in an acute crisis, right? And so it takes that coercion out of it, and it makes it less about me telling someone what to do and someone eventually shifting their norms about, well, this is just a smart thing to do. There's other ways to keep my family safe that don't do this, but they have to come to that conclusion on their own in order for that to be a sustained behavior change anyways, right?
Right.
So I agree with that's a different thing, as opposed to someone coming and saying, I'm taking this right now. That's different. And I understand we may end up having different perspectives about whether there's value in doing that.
Totally.
But when I talk about means safety, I'm usually way upstream when I'm talking about it.
So I think some things that are interesting about that is that it can shift us into having conversations that are like, so when a kid comes over to your house that is not your kid, that doesn't know things about how you do firearm safety, what do you do with your firearms? So those are conversations that a lot of firearm owners have, right? They know what their plan is. So what part of this would be integrating into that plan then. What do you do if someone in your home is struggling and maybe, oh, there's my silent partner in the back.
Silent fourth partner.
So, so we can have a conversation that's about then like, okay, so if we're having someone here who's struggling, including me, the one that owns this gun, or whoever else is in the home, what are we going to do to make this feel like a safer place for everyone? And I think that's a really different conversation than saying, like, oh, you're in crisis right now, I'm going to take stuff away from you.
Yeah. It's two totally different conversations that are usually had between different groups of people. Like there's so many more ways that those conversations are different than they are similar, even though we're talking about in this case, the firearm in both cases. But the other beauty of what you're saying, Jess, is that you can tie it in with not just suicide risk. You can tie it in with what if kids are coming over, or, you know, what if we're going to go on vacation and I'm worried about it being stolen, right? So there are all these other places, because again, with a lot of gun owners who are feeling like this is not relevant to me, why are you talking about this with me? It's tough to shift that perspective, because they're right. Most of the firearm owners never will be suicidal. It is irrelevant to them, right? Most of what I'm doing is actually sort of objectively pointless, and that it never would have come into play, but I don't know that ahead of time. And so I can tie it into the things that do feel real to them, that do map on more like viscerally relatable values that they have in that moment, and tie it into that ahead of time and say, here's one more thing you can do that's safe, but still you.
Right. And then I think there's this space too where then people can also start thinking about what safety means in their family. And it doesn't have to be defined by like us, the provider people, or suicide prevention folks, or suicidology. Is like, we can say, here's all the ranges of options, right? And what feels safe to you? What feels like safety to you? And I think that's such an important, Des is on here twice. Oh, okay. I think that's such an important thing that we don't do very often in mental health, is like allow the people who are having the experience to define what safe and unsafe means. Like so much of our ideas around safety planning and things like that are defined by us, the providers, what makes us feel like someone's safe as opposed to them. And there's a lot of space in those values discussions for them to define safety too.
Absolutely. And that's 100% how we wrapped up a clinical trial, or I guess not really, it wasn't clinical. It was random controlled trial, lethal means counseling, with firearm owning members of Mississippi National Guard who were not, they were welcome in if they were suicidal, but most of them weren't, right? So most people are coming in feeling pretty chill, but maybe their partner said, I want to get the check for this, go do that. If it wasn't, they wanted to come talk to us about firearms. They didn't even know that's what it was about. And we came from the perspective of most of us, only one of my clinicians was a firearm owner. Most of us are sort of fast talking Yankees who very clearly likely have a very different view about things, and we're meeting with them for the first time on a university campus. Like everything about this is going to feel threatening, and it's going to blow up on our faces if we said do this thing. And so the whole approach was about, hey, just tell us about you and what you do. What are you comfortable with? And several of them were like, I'm not comfortable with any of it, and I'm not going to do any of it. And we didn't kick them out. We didn't argue with them. We used approach motivational interviewing that just flat out doesn't let you say, I'm the expert, and doesn't let you argue. You just say, look, I appreciate your honesty. And the way, again, the beauty of doing this upstream, and it took a little while to get this, I think, to the point where my clinicians felt comfortable with it, was they needed to think about this as planting seeds, not picking flowers. Like, you're not going to say this thing and then the magical thing happens and everyone immediately agrees. It's when you give someone a space to disagree with you, they think about the conversation down the road when it does become relevant, and maybe they make a different decision. And we had several people who did do that. Originally were flicking us off and saying, I'm not doing any of this. And because we didn't argue, because we didn't make it a debate about the Second Amendment, they said, I thought about that conversation and I gave my firearms to my brother when I broke up with my fiance. And that mattered, right? And I think it was the structure of the conversation and the ability for folks to sort of claim their ground for who they are that made it possible for that progress to happen when the moment came when it was relevant.
So when you're having these conversations, is it just about firearms? It's like, I know that's the focus of your work, but as people are sort of out there maybe going to be talking about like means safety with people, would you recommend that they're having discussions about means in general, that they're doing upstream stuff with with guns specifically, because I mean, there are a million ways that people can kill themselves.
Yeah.
A lot of those things are things that we're going to keep in our homes, right? Like we're going to have them in our homes. So, and that includes firearms for, you know, I live in Colorado, like 80% of people here have a gun. Do you combine those conversations, or is the firearm discussion sort of different for you?
So it's a good question. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer on it, right? So we did it just with a firearm focus because I didn't want it to. There's a tendency for people to talk about lethal means, and because they're uncomfortable talking about firearms, firearm becomes a footnote or assumption. That's what people are saying, but they're not really saying it. So I just wanted, the same way I often want people to just say suicide. Don't talk about, like, just say suicide. Right?
Yeah.
Just say firearms, right? Like, just have the uncomfortable conversation and make it less uncomfortable and make progress. So in that sense, like, I felt in my sort of mission in Mississippi was, I'm going to talk about firearms. That's the focus.
Yeah.
And we recruited firearm owners. But like you're saying, that's not the reality of everybody, right? Or it's not the only reality of some of the people in the room with us there, right? So I think that, again, you have to feel the conversation out and feel people's situation out. So I don't think there's any problem with talking about everything. I think it's just really important to make sure you've touched on the most lethal method there, right? Like, I wanted to increase the odds of safety as much as possible. So I don't want the greater comfort potentially of talking about something else to let that fall by the wayside. But it also doesn't mean that you can only focus on that. The same way you don't only have to talk about suicide that we talked about before. You can talk about this in the context of your firearm being stolen, of a kid coming over and finding it, of so many other reasons why you do it. So it probably doesn't have to be just firearm. It also probably doesn't have to be just suicide. But I get so put off by people not talking about suicide openly or not talking about firearms openly that I did both.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think I have some just concern that comes up around sometimes in our field. I think when people start talking about, when they call lethal means, oftentimes what people mean is they want to talk about firearms. And I think that sometimes makes people think that, have the perspective that other means aren't lethal when we know they are, right? And so I think there's all of these ways that we talk about it can sort of shift our focus in ways that can be really harmful. So I think we really need to engage in our discussions about the methods that people are using in ways that are expansive and have opportunities for people to like figure out what feels safe and like good and helpful for them with any kind of method they're using, and without avoiding any of it.
Yeah. And it's also worth noting that some methods, that conversation is easier and that you can have some suggestions, and others it's harder, right? Like, it's harder to know what to do about some methods. And that's another puzzle for down the road that I got to figure out. But yeah, I agree. I think so. I wouldn't, my focus on firearms, I guess I'd say, isn't meant to diminish the importance of talking about everything else. It was simply to shine a light where I thought one wasn't being shown. But yeah, it would be extremely unfortunate if that got sort of taken in a method that says, well, don't talk about this other stuff. It's not important. It's not dangerous. Of course it's important. And yes, it's very frequently dangerous and lethal. I'm just talking about this because that's where I built my little niche.
Yeah. I think we all do that, right? My like niche that I always talk about is coercion. So I've already done it tonight, like right out of the gate. So yeah, I think it's so something I see happen in suicide prevention and suicidology is that people get excited about when there's anything that shows like promising evidence that it works. Sometimes we all like pile onto that one thing and want it to be the single solution. And we all know that suicide is complex, and like methods are complex. All of this stuff is really complicated. And so having nuance in the way that we talk about and think about this is always going to be really important. So I'm trying to make sure I get to all the stuff that we said we wanted to talk about. So how do you pick people to ally with to talk about firearm suicide research or just firearm suicide interventions?
So I think it depends on who you are, right? So from my perspective, I pick folks, I think, who don't necessarily agree with me. My idea is to find what is the actual community I'm trying to reach, and who is somebody who's a member of that community and who has credibility within that community, and how can I speak with them and see where there's common ground and see whether they might be folks who can convey this message more effectively than me. I think one of the places where my team has shifted our focus on our research is trying to understand what messages work, what messengers work, and what combo and what works for whom. And because not everybody buys into the same thing or hears the same thing from the same voice, right? And so when I'm trying to pick allies, I'm trying to think, well, who am I trying to reach and who is going to reach them effectively and what do they need to say? And is there any role for me in getting that information to someone who can then get that value spread across and shift the social norm about things like storing your firearms safely? The trick with it is that sometimes you can end up in a little bit of an unholy alliance if working with that person means you have to sacrifice other things. And so I've taken a pretty strong stance that like I've got a value system and things I'm willing to do and things I'm not willing to do. I'm willing to talk to anybody. I have conversations all the time with anybody, not a problem. But I'm not willing to step back from discussions of what is and is not supported by data. And so that's not a compromise. And so I think you have to go in with open eyes in these conversations about allyship to make sure that just as you're actually not asking anyone to change their values, you're not putting your values on the table as something that might be altered either. And that is something I found to be difficult. I'm doing it the way that feels right to me. I don't know if it's the right way to do it or not. But yeah, that's what I do. And also a good amount of cold calling until you've established enough of a reputation that you've got some connection here that can get to this connection there. And that makes it easier because the sort of suspicion factor goes down a little bit. And again, I spend so much time talking to, again, audiences that and groups that view the world so differently than me. I think you develop the ability to see the world through a different lens and approach the way you talk about it differently. So that, you know, I flat out I talked to a group of first responders in North Carolina, and they'd lost 9 folks in the previous year and held a conference. And what can we do? And they brought me in to talk about this. And this was one of my first times I'd ever done something on this topic. So I was super nervous. I went up and I gave my nerdy PowerPoint speech. And I felt good about it. And the leader pulled me aside after. He's like, I got to tell you, you lost 90% of my guys on your first slide because it sounded like just like a gun grab. And so it was like, oh, crap, right? Like that wasn't what I was trying to do. Mm-hmm. And so I've also taken a very effortful path to anytime I do this to say, look, here's who I am. Here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what you might be afraid I'm going to do that I'm not going to do. But if you feel like I'm doing it, tell me I'm doing it so we can stop and like rearrange how things are going. A lot of sort of candor and putting your cards on the table, I think, helps with these kinds of things too.
Yeah. I think it's like, it's interesting to me because a ton of what you're talking about is basically just being able to have good boundaries. And right, that's that, like, you know how to communicate a boundary to people, you know how to communicate your goals and stuff to people. And I find so often, you know, training people in crisis work where there's a lot of boundary setting that has to happen there, how difficult that those discussions are for people, how hard it is for people to sort of be in a room with someone who feels or believes so differently from us. And just be able to say, like, I'm still here to have this conversation. And here's the limits on what I'm going to talk about or the ways I'm going to engage in these discussions. And I think it's something that's so important for us in this field to be able to do effectively with people, is to just go in knowing where your limits are or knowing how you're going to react, or like having a plan for how you react. If it turns out someone steps all over your values in a way you didn't even know was possible, because that'll happen as well, I think, in this work. So I think that's a really sort of critical space that we could use more education for people about, just being able to do those things and have those hard conversations.
Yeah, it's a weird balance between being comfortable with who you are, so you're not easily shaken, but having enough humility to hear the other person in the room and not sort of push them any more than you're trying to not be pushed. You know, I think it's a hard balance.
Yeah, and so my background is in peer support, and so in intentional peer support, there's this concept of worldview, which is that, like, we all have our own worldview, and we want to get to a space where we can, like, recognize and understand each other's, and then have, like, beliefs that we hold closely, but then other beliefs that we're allowing ourselves to hold more loosely so we can get feedback. And I feel like that's the kind of space that it would be really, really helpful for people to be in more often when we're engaging in these discussions.
Yeah. Did you guys see Lena's commentary in the chat about ligatures?
Yeah.
No,
Can we
I
talk
didn't.
about that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not sure where we'll go with this, but I'm also interested in talking about it. So, Lena was talking about how there's a lot of reluctance in our field to talk about hanging and ligature as a method. And I know this is not really your area of focus necessarily, but I'm interested. So I have a couple of questions related to this. Are there other people that are doing a lot of means research? And who are those people, and what kinds of things are they talking about related to means? And then also, how do we like create focus on all of the methods in ways that are meaningful for the community and for the field to be able to have these discussions?
Yeah, so those are good questions. There's a lot in them. So I would agree people don't talk about asphyxiation as much. I don't have like a discomfort with it, other than to say I don't have as many. This was one of the methods I was referring to earlier, in that like we don't have as much to offer in terms of like, well, here's an easy storage method, right? I mean, there are things like collapsible coat rack, like I'm blanking on the word. So, but there are ways to make the environment a little bit safer, but that's just tougher, right? Like it's a trickier situation. I can't have the same conversation around it as I'd have around firearm, because there's less of a simple, straightforward solution to it. So I think part of the reason people talk about it less is they're not sure what to do, and a lot of times, and that doesn't mean that's right to not talk about it. But I think that's what motivates a lack of conversation, right? Like I read into it in terms of malice. I read into it in terms of like not certainty. Now, I'd say there are people who know a heck of a lot more about it than I do. I'm not the expert on suicide by hanging by a wide margin. There are a lot of people. So your first question, Jess, who are the folks doing research in this space? A lot of the folks I know, just because of the nature of what I do, are focused on firearms, but I know a lot of them are more versatile than I am. And so you're talking about folks like Amy Betts, you're talking about Craig, who was on here not that long ago, right? You're talking about Kathy Barber and Matt Miller and Dese'Rae L. There's a lot of folks out there who are focused on the methods. There's Jane Purkis, who's in, I want to say, Australia or New Zealand, someplace really, more beautiful than here, who's done a lot on different means as well. And so I think there's different folks. And I think that really the firearm conversation is what you see in the U.S. researchers, because we're in the U.S. and that's the most common method, right? And if you go into another nation where it's a different breakdown, you would likely see the conversation be different, right? And so the conversation, I think, to some extent just reflects the environment that we're in, which again shouldn't only talk about one thing. Obviously, like totally agree with that, but it's focused on this one because of the urgency and because there's only so many things we can do at a time. And so I think someone else has some niches. And just, I'm sorry, you asked a follow-up question and I've lost it.
Oh, I probably lost it too. Who are the other people? Oh, well, I don't remember it, but I do think it's worth, so Lena's had some more comments in the chat, so I wanted to just bring up a couple of things about, I think a lot of the things that you are talking about, and this is what Lena was starting to get into, is that having those discussions about values and say, like, the values of having these things available. What does it mean to make it feel safer? What would you do if you were in a crisis? All of those conversations, or if someone in your family was in a crisis or whatever, all those conversations, I think, are like the same ones that you have about other things. And it might be that actually leading in through firearm discussions can open up some of that. Too, is like if you're having a discussion about firearms already and means safety, then you can talk about some of that other stuff as well. It's like, okay, so what does it look like with other things in your household that you think somebody might use? I know with folks that I'm in community with a lot of people who are suicidal all the time. And so we all have like very frank discussions that are really focused on like what the method is that those people think about using, which is obviously then the most effective for that individual person. And there's such a difference between the way we can think about it from a public health perspective and what it looks like to do that work in an individual one-on-one basis too, that I think complicates some of these discussions.
Yeah. No, I would agree with all of that.
Is it time for Beef Corner, Des?
It might be, but I love this comment, so I'm going to pop it up on here real fast. Victoria's my new Facebook friend.
Yeah, I think some of those upstream approaches and thinking about like how we make a world that's more worth living in is really critical. And ideally we can do all of the things, right? I mean, that's what I don't want. I don't want suicide prevention to be like limited, with the exception of coercion. But I don't want suicide prevention to be limited to like one single strategy. And I think oftentimes that's what we're looking for. Yeah.
I don't think anyone in the mean safety space is. Not any of the people that I've worked with or spoken to. I think we all frame this as just one important piece that isn't being used enough. I mean, again, what mean safety does is it will help prevent death. It has nothing to do with someone having experience. This is life worth living, right? It doesn't do anything to anyone's agony. It can shape the content of your thoughts to some extent when you change the environment, but that doesn't sort of change that person's whole path to the moment that brought them to where they are, right? So yeah, no, this is one piece of a much more complex puzzle. It's just, I think, one that is underutilized. And so I harp on it a lot, with the idea being that this is something that isn't meant to replace everything else. It's meant to be tacked on. It's meant to be thought about and considered openly.
Definitely. Now it's time for beefs. That's a lot of beef. Oh,
Doja Cat just never gets boring. I love that she's really famous now and this exists in the world.
I just love.
Does she have regrets?
When I showed you that video, I couldn't believe you hadn't seen it, because it's.
I mean, I'm never gonna be okay again.
It's just so up your alley.
Just changed forever.
So this is the section where we lodge our complaints about suicide prevention or anything, really. And Daz, I feel like you have a lot of beef right now. Do you not want to start?
Mediocre white men harassing me.
Yeah.
Like, what is? I don't even know. I don't know how to like lay it out there, because it's just so fucking obnoxious. It's like, I do what I do and, stand up for what I think is right. And then is this the second or third time now that someone's decided they're going to take me down? Yeah. I don't even remember who the first one was anymore.
I don't remember either, but it was,
But yeah, it's kind of a weird situation to be in, where you feel like you have done the right thing. And granted, like, sometimes my tone is bitchy. Fine. All, like, I don't know, whatever. I'm pretty nice, damn it. But you do what you feel is right, and you stand up for the people you care about, and then you're attacked for it. And this man is like, he's going hard on me. He's found grant funders. He knows where I go to school. I'm like waiting for the email from, my department head being like, what the fuck are you doing on Twitter, dude? Who knows what. And also he apparently lives in Philadelphia, which is a little concerning, because he does have violence in his record. So it's just, it's a weird position to be in, because it's like, I feel like I did the right thing and I'm being punished for it. And I'm seeing a lot of this behind the scenes messaging about like people knowing who this person is and what his history is, and not saying anything openly, telling me behind the scenes, but then there's no, like, how do we hold these fucking people accountable? He's also attacking my friends. Like, attack me, that's one thing, but don't attack my friends just for being my friends. That is so fucked up and cruel, and that's how people do get silenced, and I'm just not having it.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's my beef.
That's a good beef. That's a fair beef.
Coral says I'm so nice. I am nice.
Yeah, I mean, you're nicer than I am. People
you smile more though.
Yeah, people think I'm nice sometimes, but I don't think they're right. It's okay. I don't need to be nice. But my beef is like social workers right now. Sorry, Des.
It's fine. It's one of my beefs too.
Wow, like I'm having these conversations on this as a part of like committee with a legislator around trying to make some mandatory requirements for suicide education, like 2 hours of suicide education every 2 years for maintaining clinical licensure. And it's not just social workers, it's like all of the professional associations are so opposed to it, and like vehemently opposed. And they're basically, one of their arguments is we shouldn't all have to serve suicidal people. And I'm like, who the fuck do you think you are that as a provider you shouldn't have to work with suicidal people? How are you going to avoid that? You don't deserve to have a license. So, and then the other thing is they're like, it implies that we don't educate people well enough about suicide in their programs. And I'm like, you fucking don't. Like, we know you don't. We have surveyed the people that are in your programs, and they tell us that they don't know how to do this work. So, yeah. Anyway.
It's so bad. It's so bad.
And it's like the people who are lobbying for this are so disconnected from the actual providers who do want to get training on these things. It's just infuriating.
But QPR is available everywhere.
QPR is not for providers. That's the other thing. We got into it, they were like, well, let's just make mental health first aid and QPR. And I'm like, that's not what you train a provider in. Like, to teach them to ask about suicide. They should know that at a minimum, but they don't. Like, I teach a suicide class in a PsyD program that is offered as an elective every 2 years in the summer. Like, that's absurd. And that's at the University of Denver here. Like, what?
Dude, the Pennsylvania chapter of NASW had a CEU for a suicide prevention CEU for watching It's a Wonderful Life.
That's not okay. Yeah. So I don't understand how that got through.
We had a discussion.
I had to jump through hoops to get NASW CEUs.
That had to go through like a whole approval system too. Like someone's like, yeah, that checks the box.
That's amazing. Lena mentioned in the chat, like, train providers to refer someone to a crisis line. You would not believe I work at a crisis line. You would not believe the number of clinicians who will sit in a session with someone and call the hotline for help because they don't know what to do when their client is suicidal.
Yeah.
That's like, what? And ask us to do an assessment on speakerphone. Like, can you do a suicide assessment on speakerphone? It's not good. I don't like it. Do better.
No, I mean, I know coming out of clinical psych programs, you have to do this like 1-year internship thing that you apply to. And when I was a student, everyone said, wow, it really will stand out that we've trained you guys to do this. And that was exciting me at first. And it didn't dawn on me at first how sad that is. That actually the fact that this really basic and important clinical skill is a thing that isn't like most folks going through doctoral programs don't have experience with this, don't get trained on how to do this. And so they maintain this discomfort of like, well, I'm just going to avoid it.
And it's like, so the other side of this is that your clients think you know how to do this. They 100% think that they are talking to someone who knows what to do. And so you're tricking them, and that's not cool either. You should, if you're not going to work with suicidal people, you need to have a disclosure on your website, put a thing on the wall next to your Live, Laugh, Love that says, I also don't work with suicidal people. Like, that's just out of control to me. But
we need to do a whole episode about that again. I guess we did that with the singer.
I feel like I'm one of the few people who's gone through from training to professional who's never actually been affiliated with a clinic that referred suicidal out. So I've actually somehow, through dumb luck, never had the experience of working in a place that did that.
Yeah.
And that's like a unicorn path, right? Like, that's not reality.
Yeah.
What's your beef, Mike?
Yeah, Mike, what do you have beefs about?
Is it suicide potatoes?
Do I know what that is?
Suicide, it's like suicide hot potato, when you pass people along who are suicidal.
I've just never heard the phrase suicide potatoes before, and it was kind of
It's a new
exciting.
one,
Awesome. Here's the thing, guys. Like, I'm trying to like, there are plenty of things to be upset about this. I'm not saying it's perfect, right? But like, the work is where I go and feel less stressed because everything else is on fire in the world. So my beef is on, I move across the country in a pandemic, and my kids can't go to school and meet other kids. So my beef's on like everything outside of this, talking about this kind of stuff, and think, the field is imperfect and things need to change, and absolutely all of that, not to invalidate any of it. But all my beefs are like when I step out of this and I'm like, I just, want to let my kid have a friend over, and I can't do that in part because we don't freaking know anybody in New Jersey. That's where my beefs are, is that honestly, like that weighs on me heavy. And for some reason, my wife and I were talking about this, January is harder than the other months. It's like the vaccine comes out, see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it makes me angrier at the tunnel. And so that's where my beefs are, is just feeling stuck in this situation of, man, like there's a lot we want to do, and I've had a chance to do it, and my kids have not had a chance to do it. And that's just upsets me, like, continuously.
We've talked about that some too. I feel like January was like, I was so angry for so long about so many things, and then I let my anger go a little bit down, and then I was just really deeply, like, profoundly sad, and I was like, this is worse, I hate this so much. That's how January has felt to me.
No, I think that's a good way of describing it. It was a shift from anger to something different. We had this thing that is not gone, but took a lot of our anger attention and made it that, and then that changed, and it could sort of lift the curtain up on some other things that maybe we're all experiencing right now. That's where my beef is, but not where my suicide potatoes are.
All right. Are your suicide potatoes in the ERPO discussion? Because I think that's our last thing to hit on. So can you explain what extreme risk protection orders are, sort of how they function, your perspectives, that kind of stuff? My dog is being really needy, so he's going to enter the screen while we talk about risk protection orders.
So extreme risk protection orders, and again, let me preface this with this: I'm not the leading expert on this, but like, I'm learning about this as I go, especially in this new job. So it comes with caveats that there's probably some inaccuracies, some oversimplifications. Do your own research on this, but let me give you like the Cliff Notes version that I've got. And so extreme risk protection orders, you may have heard them called red flag laws, which I hate as a short-term form, and they're similar to things. There are other sort of restraining orders that they'll talk about for firearms, like related things for the sort of older names. But the basic gist of an ERPO, and it depends, every state's a little bit different, both in terms of how, like, what exactly it does, how long it does it for, and who can initiate it. But the basic gist is in whatever state it is, some either family member or loved one and or law enforcement can initiate a process where they say, if there is evidence of imminent risk to self or other, you can petition a judge to temporarily remove access to a firearm. How long that's going to be removed depends on the state. So you figure about a year is a pretty common one. It can vary. In some states, it would be indefinite until it's appealed. In those states, it might be shorter. During that period, whatever it is, the person who's subject to the ERPO can appeal, either because they've gotten better or because they felt that the decision was unjust. They can sort of appeal that. And then again, in each state, it's going to vary. What is the evidence required? It's not like, well, this person has a history of depression, or it's certainly not supposed to be. It's supposed to be evidence of like imminent behavior. And then what's the criteria for returning the firearms? Some of it might just be time goes by, and some of it it might be sort of, again, making a case that things are different than they were. So that's the basic gist, is to, in a moment of extreme risk to self or other, temporarily remove access to firearms if someone has not already agreed to do that on their own.
Yeah. So that piece of like extreme risk to self or other, I just feel like is so complicated and is so open to coming from this like perspective of like discrimination and bias. I think so personally, I have some issues with like any kind of limitation of people's rights, sort of based on based on experiences they're having. So there's some concern there for me. But my bigger concern is like, as a field, we haven't consistently been very good at being able to know what extreme risk or imminent risk is. And so to build legislation around something that we are pretty freaking bad at figuring out seems like maybe not the best intervention. If maybe we could, sorry, this dog is out of control.
That's the best part of everything being virtual now, is there's so many
his name is Pumpkin. He gets really jealous when I'm talking to other people, so he likes to be involved in video calls. So you're welcome for this guy. But yeah, I just I get really concerned about our field sort of going that route and supporting these kinds of interventions when we're not good at predicting risk to begin with. We can't define it.
Yeah, and so I think that's the critical thing, right? Like we're terrible at predicting. We're no better than we were in the 1950s, right? Like then we weren't good at it then. So that's not good. It's we haven't gotten better from an already terrible place on that. So absolutely. And so the utility, like there's a couple of issues here. So one of them is the issue of rights. Let me come back to that in a second. But also the issue of like, how do you even build this? That's where, again, every state's a little bit different, and I don't know the details of it. But I also am skeptical. What exactly does that entail? I like that it's specifically and vocally not about some mental health diagnosis. So that's a plus.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily, the absence of a bad doesn't mean presence of a good, right? And so I don't know what exactly goes into those criteria. Am I skeptical? Sure. Yeah. So I think that the notion of extreme risk is a real thing. Like there are moments where someone is absolutely like, this is a moment where I'm a risk to myself or someone else. That's a thing that exists. How that's being sort of described in legislation, I don't know. I don't know who's going into developing that and what, but that's not to say that I've read it and know things are bad, right? So this isn't me saying like, well, they've done it wrong here or there. I legit don't know, right? But I have some concerns on that for the exact reason you said. The second thing is the rights thing. Yeah, again, like I left my Northeast bubble a long time ago and spent in a very different bubble, and really sort of came to the perspective of it's so much better to just converse with people about where they are and who they are, and not force one thing one way or the other. I'm also sympathetic to the perspective again of that, again, in the context of firearms, because folks cling so much to the belief that firearms are irrelevant to suicide. If that persists all the way up to that moment, and I didn't do a good enough job of convincing them of something that I would argue is quite factual, then we're in a tough spot because they were not given an opportunity to make an informed choice, right? And does that make it great to go in and take something from someone? No, like the same way it's never great to do that to anyone in any situation, right? But I'm sympathetic to the notion that there are these moments of extreme risk, and there's this weapon that changes the nature of that risk. And if we can keep time and space between that person and that weapon, they're probably going to be alive, which again is not the end goal we're looking for in all of this. It's not just alive, right? And I 100% agree with that. But it's the first part of the goal we're trying to get at. And so it's a tough situation, right? And so I weigh it. And the thing we didn't bring up yet too, Jess, is that the info that's on how ERPOs have been administered, Jeffrey Swanson, who knows a million times more about this than I ever will, is at Duke, wrote this piece I read, and I think that's what prompted us to do this, Des, was we chatted about this on Twitter. It was that, his read of the data on one of the studies is that ERPOs are being disproportionately issued to persons of color, right? And so then you have an equity issue as well. And that's not the intention of the law, but a lot of times well-intentioned laws have unintended negative consequences, right? And so that's a real issue to be like, well, if these things are being implemented in a way that disproportionately and negatively impacts a community that's already being disproportionately negatively impacted by stuff, that's not good, right? And so it's complicated. So I think that under all of this, there's a good idea to be uncovered. I don't know that it looks the way it is right now, but the only other thing I put out there, because I'm yapping too much, I'm sorry about that, guys. I got a little fired up about it, but is that, again, so much time in Mississippi, and there was never any hope that anyone was going to do anything that was about making life safer with respect to firearms. But what you're seeing is that ERPOs are passing in some red states, and that doesn't mean it's the right thing, right? But it's hard for me, having seen no progress in the places that need it most, and then see some movement there, not to be like, there's something to that is resonating with that community that other things weren't. And so there's something to that, maybe, even if it's not this form. I don't know. And so I have a lot of ambivalence, and I didn't even cover all the reasons why I had it.
Yeah.
But I'm not dismissive of it at all. And I totally respect that just makes us have different opinions on this. I don't really know my opinion on this exactly yet.
Yeah. I think there's this like fundamental, for me, there's this fundamental ethics question of like, what are the lengths that we feel are appropriate to go to keep someone from ending their life? And I feel like I'm very clear about what the lengths of that are, is that like, I think people have a right to kill themselves. Do I think that means that we should not give a shit about making the world better and doing things to support people? Absolutely not. But I think there's this fundamental ethics question there of like, what is suicide prevention's goal? What is suicide prevention supposed to do? And is using an intervention that's like coercive and takes people's ability to do the things they're wanting to do in that moment or in those moments away what we should be doing? And I think those are really important questions for us to grapple with as a field that we avoid because they're scary and hard to talk about. And nobody wants to say like, yeah, I believe I should be able to do anything I want to you to keep you from killing yourself, even if that is what they believe. Or come on the other side. I think it's scary for people to openly say like, I believe people have a right to die. I think both sides are hard, and probably most people are somewhere in the middle and they don't know what that means. And that's part of what's hard too, is that we don't know how to talk about that. So instead we end up doing these like sort of like half-assed things that they feel half-assed to me, to like pass some legislation that we're like, this is going to be helpful, because we're not willing to have this bigger other underlying conversation about like, what does it mean to prevent suicide? What are the limitations of that? And then how do we support our communities to that end?
Yeah, and there's not much to argue with on any of that. So that's great. What I'd say is, so we did talk about the disproportionate issuing of ERPOs to communities of color, which is an undeniably bad thing, right?
Yes.
Likely good thing. I would argue a very good thing is that the evidence also said the states that have implemented have saved lives, prevented suicide by the models that run on that. And so you've got those couple things right there. And so what we're missing is there evidence that people are feeling after having been the subject of an ERPO that their rights have been taken from them, that this was an experience that was bad for them, that they have been traumatized by this? Is that the story? I don't know that. I haven't heard. That's a perspective, that's a voice that isn't so far being presented in this. And so I think that impacts my ability to really evaluate it, right? If the general story is we are, for every 20 issue, we're saving one life and we're traumatizing 10, that's raising some issues of ethics and questions, right? I don't know if we're doing that though, right? And so you're laying out a hypothetical that's a very valid one and raises some really important considerations about how to think about it. I don't know that I think of ERPOs as half-assed. I don't, because I think that I know a lot of people were very involved in pushing them. I don't think they went into this half-assed at all. I think they went in this with their whole soul into it, right? To steal a lot of people's phrases for the week. That was very original and unintentional. But it's a different approach, right? And I think what needs to happen is you have to hear that voice. Like, if there is evidence that this is the experience people are having from this, that's an important thing to know. But in the absence of that evidence, I don't know that we should assume that that's the reality, right? But we also shouldn't close our eyes and look for it and then say like, well, I didn't hear it, and so it might be there, right? So people need to actively find this out and then use that, I think, to weigh in how we think about these things.
And then I think there's another piece too about. Oh, sorry.
Me, I want to go.
You go.
I think there's a difference between assuming a reality and considering a potential hypothetical scenario that people with lived experience are telling you is real and valid. And I've actually, like, I'm known to speak up, but we talked about this before we started recording, Mike. I'm known to speak up about my Second Amendment rights in response to ERPOs and stuff. And people around here think I'm a gun nut, and I don't give one single fuck about guns. But I remember recently someone asking to have a call with me, and she's pretty involved in various organizations that have to do with instituting these laws or fighting to. And I said something to her about, I think it's important to think of the person who is going to be like, who will be the person who is affected the worst by these laws? And that, the phrase I want to use is so inappropriate here. That really shocked her. She was like, wow, you've really given me a lot to think about and take away and go talk to people about. And I'm just like, wait, if we're not having this very basic consideration when we're fighting for these laws, that's scary to me.
Yeah. And I have similar conversations as when I talk to folks who are talking about things like safe storage laws. Obviously, my whole career is about safe storage, right? Someone comes and says, we should pass a bill that says you should store your firearms safely. And that might be a valid path. But also, how do you implement it? How do you find it? And is it going to be because of police contact? Well, if it's because of police contact, does that mean communities of color are going to be disproportionately impacted by it? Or is it just that we were going to punish law survivors because that's where you find out about it? Or will it actually motivate behavior change, right? And so I think that the thing to remember is I think sometimes legislation's coming from a good place of value, and it's our job as different voices and different perspectives in the suicide prevention field to voice those other things to get people to think, not because they're trying not to think about it, but because none of us are good at thinking the whole picture at once, right? And so I think that I find myself similarly just having conversations like, you might want to tap the brakes, even though I am like a safe storage guy. I mean, that surprises the heck out of people, but only because I want to say, if we do, we want to do it in a way where it's going to have the intended effect, not just to pass something and say we did it, right? And so again, like, if there are stories of the lived experience of ERPO being issued is traumatizing the same way other things have been, that's a real thing, and that impacts very heavily how I think about these things. I just don't know if that is or not, and that's not me saying I don't think it is. I legit don't know, right? I just don't know.
And I think there's also this other population of people that we need to think about too, who are people who maybe might want to access care in the future and don't because they're afraid of those orders. And I, as someone who was working in crisis services when we passed our risk protection law in Colorado, I can tell you we got a whole lot of calls about people thinking about killing themselves because of the potential of their guns being taken away because of their suicidal thoughts or their history and things like that. So I think there's just so much complication around that. And I think we missed some big things when we move forward on some of those. At least here in Colorado, we did.
Yeah. Well, I think it also creates a market to create alternatives too, right? And so there's a gun shop in New Jersey, because we just passed it like a year and a half ago, I think, that flat out markets themselves as like, you want to avoid an ERPO, we'll store your firearm for you. And so you've got folks again like Emmy Betts, who's led the charge on creating these safe storage maps, right? So you can create opportunities where you're like, look, like, let us grant autonomy to people. Let us give people safe, legal options they know about that allow them to do things on their own terms, not tell anyone else that they're doing it. Don't make law enforcement be the only place you can store your firearm safely, because law enforcement isn't going to take it unless you tell them why. And those folks aren't going to tell them why. And so they're not going to store it there, right? Like, and so creating paths for people to control their own fate on this is definitely the better way to go. And that's always what lags behind, unfortunately.
Yeah. Any last things that you want to say or talk about before we wrap up? The hour always goes so fast.
It really does.
The only thing I say that I think is sort of elephant we didn't talk about is the thing that's taking a lot of my attention, is just being aware that all our conversations about firearms, what we know and what we don't know, might or might not apply to the moment we're in. A lot of the research isn't done in the context of world's on fire. And the world's on fire. And while the world's been on fire, there's been an unprecedented surge nationwide in firearm purchasing. And the research I have out there now shows that the folks who are purchasing the surge are far more likely to have had lifetime thoughts, past year thoughts, past month thoughts of suicide, which is fundamentally different than anything else we've seen. And so I'd say wherever you are in the space of suicide prevention, if you're a crisis counselor, if you're whatever it is, just be aware that like the moment you're in matters, and someone's decision to have purchased a firearm now may be different than it would have been in the year before or the year next year. And so you have this group of folks who may be hurting more than a lot of gun owners are. And so being aware of that and keeping that context in mind matters. I just think it's a point that's getting lost in all the other stories that are going on about all the difficult things we're dealing with. It's just that there's a lot of risk.
Yeah, this year is just everything. It's everything cranked up to 11 and then a bunch of other stuff thrown in on top. So yeah, I don't think we're even going to begin to know the scope of what has happened for a while here.
Hey,
Yeah.
Do y'all remember New Year's Eve when people were like, 2020 is over, 2021's gonna be great, and 2021's like, so hey, let's discuss.
New Year's Eve was like 6 years ago, I think, actually.
Yeah. 2021 is like I mean, we're still in it all, right? We're not even to the fallout stage yet, so.
Oh yeah, and it looks like Senate just did some obnoxious shit that I have to double check on when we get off here.
Oh no. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. This was really great. I really appreciate just being able to like navigate some of that gray area with people. It's really awesome. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
This was
awesome.
Fun. Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. All right, guys.
I'm gonna end the broadcast. It's
All
gonna be
right.
great.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.